The front line is combat at its most brutal. It drives people to extreme acts for many complex reasons.
They were fighting for each other, not for patriotism, but for their buddies.
We reveal the most decisive front lines in the Second World War and take you deep into the heart of battle with the men who were there.
They were attacking with divisions, and I had one rifle company with about 100 men.
I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food, and we were hurting.
It was Hitler's last gamble, and no one saw it coming.
No one's ever going to mount an assault through this kind of overgrown, wooded area. Well, somebody had.
It was the toughest US battle of World War II, and almost its greatest defeat.
And the Americans know that they have to stand and fight. What's going to happen is they're going to be overwhelmed.
In early December 1944, the Allies thought the war was all but over and the Nazi war machine broken for good. But they'll have a surprise in store on a front line so quiet it's called the Ghost Front. For Hitler, the border between Germany and Belgium is anything but ghostly. A vast buildup of men and tanks has been assembling for months in a region called the Ardennes.
The German offensive in the Ardennes was essentially the last great throw of the dice by Adolf Hitler. This was his gamble. This was where he was going to put all of his remaining resources on the Western Front. As many tanks as he could, as many men as he could, as many planes as he could.
For the Allies, the Ardennes front line is so safe from the enemy, it's where battle-weary units are sent to recuperate and green troops come to toughen up.
The Allies are not really expecting a huge offensive in this particular part of the front. They're also not sure whether the Germans are able to launch an offensive at all, because the Germans have taken quite some beatings since the days of Normandy, and so they think that the Germans are simply not able to launch a huge offensive.
Even more reassuring for senior Allied commanders, the Ardennes is one of the most difficult places to carry out any offensive, especially by an army that's all but finished.
The terrain itself is almost designed by God to make it impossible for armoured warfare. It's very, very densely wooded, lots and lots of rivers, deep ravines, and it was the depths of winter. Worst winter in Europe for 40 years, snow deep on the ground, absolutely horrific temperatures. So as far as the Allies were concerned, there was no threat there.
US forces stationed on the front line are the new recruits of the 106th Infantry Division and the 14th Cavalry Group, novice soldiers fresh from South Carolina and stretched thinly patrolling 30 kilometers of German border. Most have never seen a shot fired in anger. Hitler's plan: to drive three armies straight through the Ghost Front, over 300 kilometers west to the coastal port of Antwerp in a lightning attack. Hitler has gathered his most hardened fighters. Crack SS divisions will be targeting Antwerp. While in the center, the 5th Panzer Army is charged with taking Brussels, under the command of highly decorated tactician General Hasso von Manteuffel. Reporting to him, the aristocratic General Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. Alongside him, hardened by years on the Russian front, General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division. In the utmost secrecy, almost 500,000 men and 4,000 tanks, assault guns and artillery prepare to attack. As the countdown to battle approaches, a deathly hush settles over the forests, concealing the Reich's great last bid for victory. Under heavy cloud, and in the worst winter for a generation, the Germans strike their completely unsuspecting enemy in a dawn attack of blistering ferocity.
5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of December, the German barrage opens up. And it's the largest German barrage that they've had on the Western Front, so the most guns that they've been able to concentrate since the D-Day campaign. And German soldiers are not used to that weight of firepower, and for once they feel, you know, the god of war is kind of on their side. Their enemy is completely surprised. They are deluged with artillery and an absolute firestorm of German infantry and Panzergrenadiers coming towards them out of the morning mist.
We could see the land in front of our sector, erupting with explosions. One had the impression that the whole world was going under. Such a massive and unrelenting drum fire I had never experienced before.
The sparse US defense falls instantly. The front line is smashed and bulges out into Belgium before the advancing tanks. Hitler's massive breakout will have to stay on hard roads, securing the towns they pass through. The first and most important is Bastogne.
If you held Bastogne, you held the entry points, the gateways to most of Western France, and most particularly the giant port city of Antwerp. Everything in the Ardennes is about getting the roads, getting the towns that control the roads, and never more than at Bastogne.
Crucial to the attackers' grueling schedule is direct travel. Any detour in the unforgiving terrain means a catastrophic waste of fuel and time for the tanks and their supporting units.
Tanks, particularly German Panzer designs, had wide tracks so that they could go through swampy ground, very, very good at cross-country terrain. However, every one Panzer there's 30 trucks and scout cars and so on, all behind them, on wheels, and they were just not designed in any way, shape or form to be able to grow cross-country.
But even with hard roads and a direct route, there's still a major problem for Hitler. Economically, Germany is on its knees. Everything is in short supply, not least fuel.
An army might march on its stomach, but a panzer needs fuel. And a World War II German panzer needed an awful lot of it. Typically, one tank would get it about 100 miles. After that, it would need to be refueled with these. These are 20-litre jerry cans. The problem was there were steep ravines, heavily wooded terrain, very, very difficult to grow cross-country. And of course, whereas a panzer might be able to go cross-country, the truck carrying these most definitely can't. And the solution that Hitler hit upon was to steal the fuel from the Americans as they advanced. They would take it from their own fuel dumps. But it turned out to be a complete fantasy.
With the assumption of straight, hard roads, an abundance of fuel to seize and no enemy resistance, Hitler decides his attack can be done in record-breaking time. So he sets a punishing schedule for his commanders.
To get his forces through the Ardennes, Hitler has given his armies a timetable really tight of only 2 days. Now this is bizarre because in 1940, his favourite general, Major General Erwin Rommel, had gone through the Ardennes and had taken 3 days. But in the middle of winter, when the terrain is even more difficult, Hitler wants his 3 armies to do that march in 2 days.
The first hours of the German offensive are devastating to the American defenders, and German infantry can barely believe the ease of their attack.
Half crouched, instinctively presenting a smaller target, we cautiously began moving forwards. In a short time, we arrived at the first houses and opened fire at windows and doors. I could see American soldiers running from the houses. I even saw one of them in his underwear. Our company had successfully captured the southern part of the village.
The American defenders of Bastogne are hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. So they have to play their only card the best they can.
One thing that the American defenders can do is slow those German attackers down as much as possible, so that the British and American forces in other areas can come and reinforce the defenses.
As the 5th Panzer Army powers down to take Bastogne, there is nothing in its way to match it. In the town itself, The only Allied presence is the battle-worn remnant of the US 28th Infantry Division, recovering from months of fighting. With air backup, they could stop the attackers. But there's a problem.
Remember that the great advantage the Allies had was air power. Thousands of fighters and bombers flying from Britain and from France could come in and launch massive attacks on German units. But those fighter bombers were reliant on having clear air to fly in. That means that the great American advantage is actually neutralized. The story of Bastogne is that the American ground troops are on their own. They're gonna have to figure out a way to stop the Germans by themselves.
In Bastogne, with the German panzers closing fast, the commander of the exhausted 28th Infantry Division, Major General Troy Middleton, has to think quickly.
What General Middleton has to do is he has to figure out a way to stop the Germans short of the town when he's desperately outnumbered, desperately outmanned. Middleton is trying to throw together scratch combinations of any kind of soldiers that he can find who will still fight and send them forward and try to slow the Germans down.
And they are rough and ready ad hoc groupings of guys in half-tracks, some artillery, basically mobile units, a few tanks, whatever is available. And there are a whole series of these which are put out about 10 miles distant in a ring all the way round Bastogne. And what they are is a tripwire. And they're there to buy time and, if necessary, be sacrificed. Because what you can't have is the Germans coming into the centre of Bastogne at all costs. I mean, if Bastogne falls, then the Germans are through the Ardennes like a knife through butter, and the whole American front will collapse.
Adding to the problems that the Americans were facing was that not only are they trying to slow down the Germans, but they're also dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers who've taken on the status of something like refugees. They're just trying to get out of there, desperately streaming back from a front line that's been cracked open by the German attack.
Now, rapid advances, clashes, and retreats flare up in the winter twilight, with neither side clear on their positions. Chaos reigns as intelligence and orders become irrelevant the moment they're given.
Both sides are equally confused as to where the others are, so these are meeting engagements with a lot of troops floundering around in difficult terrain, and it's pretty sharp and pretty bloody.
It's a recipe for disaster, it's a recipe for chaos, and the Germans are going to use it as much as they can.
They get their chance on a narrow road approaching Bastogne.
Troy Middleton was the corps commander responsible for the defence of Bastogne. What he needed to do was, in effect, throw out a line of outposts to delay the advancing Germans as much as possible. He formed these teams, and they were thrown out to the villages surrounding Bastogne to the east so that they could force the Germans to fight through and delay them. What they didn't foresee was that as they were advancing along a single road towards Longvilly, is that they were met by American troops retreating in the other direction. And of course, they weren't able to get off the road and get round each other. So what they had was this absolute traffic jam from hell. And what they created, in effect, was a massive target that the Germans could take advantage of if they arrived. And unfortunately for the Americans, that's exactly what happened. So coming down the road, chasing the retreating Americans, in effect with the lead elements of the Panzer Division, and they took full advantage. And what this turned into came to be known as the turkey shoot. All the lead vehicles rained down fire from their 75mm cannon right into what was the utter chaos going on this single-track road, and it turned into an absolute slaughter.
Vehicles and men were hit by flying shrapnel, and the screams from medics were drowned by the crack of the bursting artillery shells. Split-second decisions had to be made, and it was decided to take as much of our equipment across country as we could.
Men and machines flee in disorder into the surrounding countryside. The rest are left to their fate. By the end, over 100 American vehicles are wiped out, their occupants dead, captured, or missing. With the Americans scattered, Bastogne looks defenseless. But on the outskirts, General Fritz Bayerlein holds his Panzer Lehr division back.
He received some intelligence from a local that there was a large American armoured force close by. He decided not to barrel through Bastogne, take it by a coup de main, but instead send out smaller forces to reconnoitre the area and see what he was actually facing.
But Bayerlein's information is false. There is no American tank army, and although he doesn't know it, Bastogne is there for the taking. In the town, a dark mood of panic and fear takes hold. Schools are closed. Civilian refugees stream out west. Belgian and Allied flags are removed. The first of the wounded American soldiers arrive. Bastogne's defenders are told to expect reinforcements, but who and when is anyone's guess. And all the time, the German forces are tightening their grip. Unwilling to attack Bastogne, the Germans begin a slow creep around the town, intending to encircle it. The defenders don't know it yet, but it is the beginnings of a siege.
If you think of Bastogne as a fist and two pincers slowly working their way round the fist, and the pincers are two German armoured divisions accompanied by infantry.
In the confused conditions around the town, any kind of front line is impossible to determine by either side.
You find the two sides completely mixed up, trying to occupy the same piece of ground, and it's only when an American goes over to borrow a pick from a neighbouring unit he finds they're Germans rather than Americans. You realise just how confused this sort of situation is.
The race to take Bastogne has now turned into a long game of encirclement, never intended in Hitler's plan. The cautious German strategy now gives the Allied command a golden opportunity to save the town, but they'll only get one shot.
The American commanders are looking for any units they can find to try and plug the gap, any effective units.
They turn to their nearest reserve forces, who happen to be paratroopers.
The American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, as they were called, is one of the elite units that the U.S. Army put together. The 101st is on R&R and Rheims. They're available, they're able to move quickly, they're not engaged in any other front, and so the U.S. grabs them and sort of throws them into Bastogne.
We were going to go to the States and get a furlough and then go to Guam to get ready to jump on Japan. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, and Sergeant came in, turned on the lights, said, get up, there's been a breakthrough, you're going. And I said, oh, you're full of shit. We don't have any winter clothes. We don't have any rifles. Our crew-served weapons are turned in. But I was wrong.
They are literally put in the back of every truck that the Americans can mobilize.
We loaded up, standing up, not enough room to sit down. They just put us in like cattle.
Military policemen are stopping trucks at gunpoint. They're having to unload whatever it is they're carrying, and these airborne soldiers are bundled unceremoniously into the back.
It was a kind of a drizzly rain. We went about 109 miles in that rain with lights on at night, and I knew then that this really was serious.
As they race to the front, the paratroopers must contemplate the impossible, taking on an invading army with little more than what they can carry.
In many ways, they're the worst possible unit to put there. They don't have any tanks. They don't have any heavy weaponry. They don't have any of the equipment that they need to fight off a German panzer attack.
So it's all very well Eisenhower deploying airborne divisions, but they're designed to be shock forces. They've only got the ammunition they can carry, and of course there's going to be no resupply because this is a siege.
As they move up to Bastogne, a lot of the 101st soldiers are stopping the retreating American soldiers, the refugees, and sort of taking their ammunition, taking any kind of equipment they have from them.
And they were all disoriented, and some of them crying. And they said, where are you guys going? We said, we're going to fight. And they said, oh, they'll kill you, everybody. They're killing everybody. One officer from another unit found some ammunition, and as you went by, you picked up whatever was there. We dumped us off in a muddy field. We started walking, and I saw a little sign that said Bastogne. That's how ignorant we were. We didn't even know how to pronounce the name, didn't know what country it was.
As the Germans prepare to crush the town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st sends his men out to defend it.
When the 101st arrive in Bastogne, they arrive just before the Germans, and I mean literally a couple of hours. So it's an incredibly close-run thing, and the Germans don't realise just how they frittered away the time that they had. Had Byline not lingered, he would have been in Bastogne before the 101st, and the Americans would have been too weak to stop that happening.
If you picture a wagon wheel and the spokes, Bastogne was the hub of the wheel, and we were the spokes, various units. And it so happened that my spoke was one of the main roads, and that's where we fought.
We pulled into a big barnyard and unloaded. The commander says, get your troops off. I want you to get up this road here. You run into the Germans and stop them. I say, yes, sir. They were attacking with divisions, the Germans were. And I had one rifle company with about 100 men.
The biggest killer of infantry in the Second World War was not bullets, but shrapnel from artillery shells. The foxhole, or slit trench, offers some protection, but with the enemy closing in, protecting yourself is yet another race against time.
So this is the standard US Army issue M1943 entrenching tool. It's light, it's compactable, can be used both as a pick and as a shovel. The first thing the Screaming Eagles wanted to know when they arrived was how long before the Germans were going to get there, because that's how long they've got to dig. If they were lucky, they'd find something like this, a shell crater. Absolutely perfect, the job's already half done. If not, they'd have to go outside and start digging themselves. First thing the soldier's got to do is dig down and dig fast. Use the entrenching tool firstly as a pick to break the ground. Once he's started to get into the ground, move the shovel to its proper dig position and then start to cut down as fast as he possibly can. Conditions in a hole in the ground, unless you're a plant or a tree, are awful. They tend to fill with water, they're cold, they're inhospitable, and clearly they're filthy. If you're there for over a day or two, then life becomes incredibly hard. You can't move, you're stuck in your foxhole, it invariably starts to fill with water, it soaks through whatever you're wearing on your feet, and if you're not careful, you're going to get trench foot and become debilitated. Cooking and eating all have to happen in the trench, and all of the bodily functions do as well. You can't just stand up, you have to do it inside of your trench and deal with it in that situation. And that all makes living conditions, particularly in the winter when it's cold, absolutely dreadful for anyone who's got to live in a foxhole.
As the 101st dig in, over 300 kilometers south and soon to arrive in Bastogne, Private Clayton Bird would find conditions considerably harsher in the Ardennes. So harsh that unconventional methods would be needed.
The ground was so frozen, it was absolutely impossible to dig a foxhole with any kind of tool that we had. What we did, we took TNT and blasted. The resulting holes were such that instead of having 1 or 2 persons within a foxhole, they blasted out so much dirt that we could put 6 or 8 people in the resulting crater.
For many of the defenders, the biggest enemy is not the Germans, but the bitter cold. For medics are struggling with frostbite, trench foot, exposure, and hypothermia. Dangers the 101st have not prepared for.
Bastogne, in late December 1944, was in the grips of one of the worst winters in history. The Germans trying to take the town had the advantage of knowing that they were going to be on the offensive. Many of them had experience on the Russian front and were equipped with reversible smocks and full winter gear. They were going to need this as the snow was deep, temperatures were dropping through the floor. The Americans, rushing to defend the town, were not so well equipped. They grabbed whatever kit they could, and unfortunately, a lot of that kit was not fit for purpose. Combat gear, para trousers and para smock. Cotton, lightweight, comfortable, no good for winter. Greatcoat. Wool, it's heavy, would keep you warm, but as soon as it got wet, it's like wearing concrete. That happened very, very quickly, and then onwards, the troops were standing there freezing. Para boots, standard issue. They were leather, but they weren't waterproof. In a foxhole soon filling up with water, it was only a matter of time before the paras started to have issues with things like trench foot, which was debilitating. If they were lucky, and not many of them were, they would have overboots. These would fit over and would be waterproof and would keep your feet dry. However, hardly any of them were lucky enough to have a pair of these. Overall, if you were an American defender of Bastogne that December, it was a very unhealthy place to be.
Conditions on the ground deteriorated.
When we arrived at Bastogne, there was no snow on the ground at all. And the next night, it started snowing. And it snowed before it stopped about knee-deep.
The temperature went down to as low as 15 below zero. We were dressed in what I have on right here, nothing else.
We had a number of people who had a frostbite on their feet, for example.
You know, when you're really cold, you shiver to keep warm. We had so little food that there was not enough energy, and we quit shivering. That means you're really in bad shape, and the doctors couldn't understand how we survived.
They said, change your socks every day. And even in combat, we did that. And we changed them, and we did the best we could. And yet, at the same time, we suffered horribly.
As the Germans tighten their grip on Bastogne, they inflict a devastating blow on the defenders.
Our whole medical company that was on the tail end of our command was cut off. They were captured. The whole command, the whole medical unit.
In the confused hours of arrival, 143 men and officers of the US 326th Medical Company are gone.
And that robs the defenders of a lot of medical supplies, but also all the nursing staff and surgeons and so on. So they're left with very little, and that means they have to rely on the locals who help them out. Bandages come from bed sheets. Belgian civilians become the nurses. And so one of the sort of signature problems that the defenders have is they're very short of medical supplies and trained medical staff.
Eisenhower and his senior commanders know that the 101st can only hold on for so long. The crisis leads to an emergency meeting with Montgomery and Patton, who's commanding the 3rd U.S. Army to the south of Bastogne.
Now, at the meeting, Eisenhower asked both Montgomery and Patton how quickly they could turn their forces and attack northward into the Ardennes against the Germans. Disengaging your army from active combat, make a solid left or right turn, and go in a completely different direction. Armies are not good at doing that. Montgomery, being the sensible, somewhat conservative British commander, said, it'll take me 2 weeks. Patton said 2 days. And Eisenhower said, George, don't mess with me. And Patton said 2 days. And so Eisenhower said, all right, if you can do it, do it.
With the two German armies sweeping around it to north and south, Bastogne is effectively encircled. Worse, the one road that could offer relief from Patton's Third Army is cut off, and the skies are thick with winter cloud that could last for weeks. Knowing the defenders are in a desperate situation, the Germans offer them an opportunity to surrender.
People have asked me, well, did you think about surrendering? And I said, no, there wasn't a single soul that ever said a single word about surrender. That was not in our vocabulary. We were trained not to think that way. We are always going to prevail no matter what.
The German corps commander surrounding Bastogne is an old-school Prussian general aristocrat called Freiherr von Luttwitz. So he writes a note saying, you've got to surrender, or superior forces will crush you. And McAuliffe realizes he's got to do something. And he looks at this note and says aloud to his command group in their operations room, nuts. And so the famous response is typed up from the American commander of Bastogne to the German commander, nuts. And off it goes.
On the 22nd, the German commander, ridiculously enough, demanded surrender of the surrounded town. I just replied, nuts, for I knew that one word best expressed the feelings of the division.
Von Luttwitz has blown it because he's tried to bluff the Americans into surrender, and he knows he hasn't got enough forces to actually force the issue and destroy everyone in Bastogne, as he threatened to do.
The siege went on. They gave us 2 hours to think this over, or they're going to annihilate us. So we all sat around waiting for this to happen. Nothing happened.
With their bluff failed, the Germans vow to crush Bastogne, and the Americans prepare for the worst that their enemy can throw at them. Each side will have to maximize whatever advantage is on offer.
The American defense of Bastogne, as weak as it was to begin with, had a few things that worked in their favor. And one of the most important ones was the design of the town of Bastogne itself. You might actually say it looks a bit like the structure of a medieval fortress with outposts. And these could be utilized by the American forces, and these could be strengthened and defended against the advancing German troops. On the German side, what you find is that their advance through these built-up areas, of course, causes problems because the moment you drive armor into built-up areas, tanks become lame ducks, and it's relatively easy for the enemy to knock these out.
But taking out panzer tanks is hard if you're armed only with light weapons. American infantry and paratroopers have their own special reasons to persevere when faced with enemy armor.
Infantrymen just don't like tankers because they have it far easier. They're warmer, they're out of the wind and the rain, etc. They've got a vehicle, they don't have to walk everywhere, everything can be stowed. Life is peachy as far as the infantry is concerned if you're in a tank. Infantrymen have an inbuilt desire to humiliate them and destroy them anyway, and that's not even the enemy, and so on. That's your own side. The weapons that you have to take those tanks on, handheld weapons such as bazookas, are useful, but their range is very, very short, and so is their penetrating power.
We didn't even try to penetrate the armor of the German tank. We just didn't have the weapons to do it. We had a bazooka. We would try to hit the tread, and then that would leave the German tank where he could not move. And that's the best, ordinarily, that we could do against the German tanks.
The 101st and McAuliffe are holding the line, but time and ammunition are running out. Night and day, the Luftwaffe bombs Bastogne blindly through the thick cloud, eventually racking up massive damage and forcing civilians and defenders underground. But every hour of the siege now works to the Allied advantage. Hitler expected to have taken Antwerp by now, but is hopelessly ensnared in a fight for a small provincial town barely 50 kilometers from the old front line.
What we get is mission creep, and Hitler obsesses about taking Bastogne. If the whole purpose of trying to take Bastogne is that you can drive through it quickly as a route centre, then sending your Luftwaffe to bomb it every night is completely bonkers and makes no sense at all, which shows you just how, clinically insane Hitler has got.
Germans now attack repeatedly, looking for weak points on the defensive perimeter. Each attack is increasingly fierce and intense, and the 101st have to work out how to make the most of what dwindling resources they have. It will bring out the best in their commander.
The Americans are incredibly fortunate that McAuliffe is defending Bastogne, because he's the artillery commander of the 101st, so he understands how to deploy and use guns most effectively. And so what he creates is a pool of all the artillery pieces that are in Bastogne, whether they belong to his division or not. And they're all placed in the centre of Bastogne, and they are given fire missions, so the entire lot fire their ammunition at any German attack.
Our artillery guys zeroed in on the tanks and knocked out a couple of them. We held on, and then the Germans attacked again and again.
The American defense can just about hold as long as the Germans concentrate their attacks singly.
If the Germans had attacked in two places at one time, they would have run all over us. But they attacked in a single place each time, and we managed to stop them.
On the dawn of Christmas Eve, a dramatic change in the weather sends morale soaring. A crystal clear sky brings hundreds of supply planes. Ammunition rains down on the embattled defenders in a 400-ton Christmas present, and the hope that all is not lost.
We got a break in the weather, and some C-47s came in and threw out some bundles of ammo.
After the planes started flying, the first things came in were not food, it was ammunition.
More than ammunition, Bastogne needs reinforcements, but Patton's men have problems of their own, the weather and stiff resistance from the enemy.
Patton always believed that he could get his army moving faster than anyone else. But what Patton discovered was the same things that had slowed the Germans down as they were moving forward were now slowing the Third Army down. The weather was terrible. There was an enormous amount of snow on the terrain and on the roads. There were a lot of American refugees still flooding out of the area. And so what Patton hoped would be a lightning relief of Bastogne actually turns into a slugging match.
Knowing the advantage of cloud cover has been lost, and with Patton slowing down, the Germans try one last time to break the town. On the night of Christmas Eve, troops on both sides get ready for what will be the final desperate bid to end the siege. General Manteuffel gives his commanders the best troops available, fresh from fighting on the Italian front, well-equipped and experienced.
During the night, German Air Force bombed the city. And in the early hours, the Germans then launched an attack in the northeast of the Bastogne perimeter.
The Germans should be able to walk into Bastogne, but despite their exhaustion, the Americans have levels of experience and cohesion that make them a fearsome opponent.
They were deliberately organized and trained to be an elite unit. They are extremely motivated soldiers. They're extremely physically fit soldiers. They are less at this point about sheer combat effectiveness and more about a bloody-minded unwillingness to stop fighting.
The 101st Airborne now rename themselves the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, and it will be a name that officers and men adopt with equal pride.
You're top officers, even clear up the generals, suffered with you. They're not way back and saying, go get them. They're out front saying, follow me. There's lines you don't cross, and you understand that. You keep respect for your officer, but still, he's in the foxhole next to you, and he's suffering like you are, and it becomes, you become a lot more personal.
You're tired, you're cold, you're wet, you're miserable, you're starving, you're running low on rations, and a lot of your friends around you are getting killed. But they kept their morale high, and one thing they used to say was, the Germans have got us surrounded, the poor bastards.
From the German point of view, the original objective of the mission has been completely abandoned. Infantry units that were intended to fight for Antwerp are now doing something wildly different.
This is a radically different plan from what was intended originally with the Battle of the Bulge. The infantry had been diverted to launch frontal assaults, supported by a few tanks, in appalling weather.
Bastogne, in its geography, it was surrounded by small hamlets and large farmhouse and farm complexes. And what those farmhouses and mini hamlets allowed the Americans to do was to delay and keep the Germans at bay and bring an enormous amount of artillery fire in particular to bear.
And the defenders have the added advantage of using their anti-aircraft half-tracks in the ground attack role. And that means 4 very powerful half-inch Browning machine guns depressed to shoot at infantry.
What they wanted to do was to saturate the German attackers with as much high explosive and shrapnel as they possibly could. And the Brownings and so on, perfect for that. And they would use those to literally fire into the mass of the attacking infantry and so on, and then let the explosive and shrapnel do its work and tear the advancing attacking troops to pieces.
As Christmas Day dawns, every man of the 101st is in the fight of his life. Before long, the centre of Bastogne is within sight of the German attackers.
McAuliffe can see everything that's going on. It looks as though the Germans are going to penetrate the defences. His staff officers get quite nervous and they prepare to sort of shred and burn documents and things like that. There was great sort of fear. The simple weight of numbers would prevail against the Americans.
That was one time I thought, this is it, because they had a bunch of infantry and some tanks, and there was no way I could stop them. I was either going to become a POW or get shot. The reserves from the whole division went to that point and stopped them again.
On Christmas Day, the Germans launched their biggest attack with infantry and tanks in large numbers from the west of Bastogne and the rear of the position. Prisoners later told us that their officers had told them that Bastogne was to be a Christmas present for the Führer. The Christmas present consisted of a number of hulks that lie in the center of the ground back of Bastogne now.
By 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, it's clear that the German assault has failed. But there is no sign of any relief for the Americans. Only Patton's forces from the south offer any hope for the defenders. All eyes are on the star US general, who is convinced he will prevail.
George Patton has destiny written all over him, and there's a higher purpose in his generalship. He wants to ride to the rescue of Bastogne. Now, he has very high standards for himself, and he expects his army to live up to that. So he puts the fear of God into his own army, never mind the Germans, and is quite convinced that God is on his side.
Divine intervention may have come with the clear weather, but that has brought its own problems.
The sky's clear, but the ground temperature goes right down. Everything turns to ice, and that makes it incredibly difficult for the troops to maneuver. The ice underneath means that it's a skating rink for tracked vehicles that just sort of skate along. So actually the American armour finds the going much, much tougher.
On December the 26th, there are close to 1,000 Allied casualties and over 100 German wounded in Bastogne. All are in dire need of medical attention, but the town has little to offer them.
The Americans knew that in terms of both morale and for the men's lives themselves, this was something they had to tackle as soon as they possibly could. And so hence why they decided the only way they could do this is to send in a medical team, by all things, by glider.
The gliders are towed in and land silently close to the front line. The team has no shortage of work to do and carries out 63 operations in the first 24 hours.
Oh, I guess there must have been 5 medical officers came in. We sent them to the aid station, and they started working on the wounded. And I was glad I did, because 2 days later I was back there myself.
Bastogne is really just one huge general hospital full of all the combat casualties, but almost as many with pneumonia, freezing problems, and trench foot because the weather is so awful.
As Patton's 4th Armoured Division grinds its way towards Bastogne along 3 corridors from the south, it hits determined resistance. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army holds the Americans at bay, convinced that Patton is flagging. For the Germans, the capture of Antwerp is still a possibility.
So what Patton hoped and believed would be a blitzkrieg-esque attack right into the flank of the German advance to shatter it, to grind it to bits, turned into an attritional move where he was literally fighting for every yard and every kilometre that his men were travelling against a determined enemy through the same conditions that were befuddling the German attackers themselves.
A vicious firefight at the hamlet of Assaunois is the last hurdle before Patton's spearhead, the 318th Infantry Regiment of the 80th Division, reaches the 101st. The siege is over.
On December 26, at 5 p.m., we made contact with friendly troops. Through it all, no one doubted for an instant that we would hold the town under any sort of attack the Germans could put on. The 101st Airborne Division has met and defeated the Germans and will continue to do so whenever called upon.
You understand, the 101st, we were glad to be relieved at Bastogne. I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food, and we were hurting, but we were a cohesive unit.
Now, you've heard that Patton rescued us, and that's not true. We did not need rescue.
We were glad to get relieved, believe me, but rescued we were not, because we were still full of fight.
The first vehicles through to Bastogne are 150 ambulances.
What Patton's Third Army is now going to do, once they've arrived in Bastogne, is ensure that the Germans have reached their high tide mark, and then block any further advance. And that's really all over for the Germans as far as the Battle of the Bulge is concerned.
Troy Middleton, the commander of the 28th Infantry, is praised for his efforts by his commander, General Patton. And Anthony McAuliffe earns a Distinguished Service Cross for his contribution, along with a lifelong nickname of Nuts.
Both Middleton and McAuliffe handled the situation about as well as they could, given the context of what was going on. Especially, I think, McAuliffe, who recognized that his job was as much as possible to stop the Germans from getting any farther down that road. The house was on fire, and they had been given the job of putting the fire out with a garden hose and a bucket. Did they do everything perfectly? Did they do everything right? Absolutely not. But did they do enough? Yes, and they're one of the primary reasons why the Germans didn't get any farther than they did.
If Bastogne's frontline commanders and the men serving under them go down in history as examples of military excellence and bravery, the question remains why Hitler's massive build-up was ever allowed to progress as far as it did.
I have always maintained it didn't need to happen. The 106th Regiment and the 28th Regiment were put in there because that was a quiet place. And they were reporting to intelligence that there was massive troop movements on the other side with tanks and trucks. And intelligence came back to them and said, oh, they're playing records. They were known to do that. There's nothing wrong. If they had sent even one patrol over there, they would have seen what the actual situation was, and they could obliterate it with bombing.
The great failure on the Allied side in the Ardennes, it's the generals who don't think the Ardennes is a vulnerable spot. It's Eisenhower and Montgomery and Bradley who think no one's ever going to mount an assault through this kind of overgrown, wooded area. Well, somebody had quite recently mounted a massive panzer assault through exactly that territory. The Germans had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, largely because they attacked through the Ardennes forest.
This was, you know, in my view, the worst intelligence error of the Allies during the Northwest European campaign. They had Bletchley Park, they had all the ultra decrypts, they ruled the skies in terms of air reconnaissance and so on. They had better signals intelligence. The one area that they didn't consider was a threat was the Ardennes.
For the 101st Airborne, the Siege of Bastogne was one of their proudest achievements. The battered bastards of Bastogne held out far longer than paratroopers are meant to in conditions they were unequipped for, and their fighting spirit was undimmed to the end. In the 40 days of the Battle of the Bulge, over 20,000 soldiers were killed on both sides, with deep scars on the civilian population felt to this day. Despite the heavy American losses, it's regarded as the American military's greatest wartime battle, and by some, the greatest of all time.